right. Shall we get going? Can everybody hear me? No? I can walk around, talk to everybody. The what? Oh, online? Is it loud enough online? All right, cool. As my microphone falls off. Everybody ready? All right. I get to be Earl Doobie 2.0 since Earl's not here tonight. So for those of you who don't know me, Eric Willey, CISO for American Axle, VP Treasury and local AV guy for CSA Detroit. Appreciate everybody coming out to the event. A little bit lighter crew today. It looks like we got quite a few online though, but really appreciate everybody being here. So it's quick, just looking at the agenda. Just call out the board again on everybody who's here. So appreciative of this group that helps put all of this on, especially call out one name or two names, Rob and Michael, and really kind of bringing everybody in. So a lot of work that goes into building out these events, and really appreciate everybody pulling together. So we just launched a new website. Thanks, you Sid. Hand raised in the back. So check it out. Give us critiques, anything we need to change. The idea is, Earl covered in the last presentation, that the idea is we want to start doing more live streaming, getting out in front of people. So we also have a YouTube page. We're live streaming on Twitter, and then if you check my LinkedIn page, we're live streaming there as well. So all of this is live right now, as well as traditionally on Zoom for those of us that are connected. So appreciate everybody that is virtual. We'd love to have you here in person. And with that, we can't do it without our sponsors. So Synac, I will turn it over to Ron and let you take it away.
Ants, like you gotta sell it, man. I'm Ron Olko. I'm a director of product at Synac. I won't tell you about what product I sell because we're supposed to be agnostic. For the most part, I have a weird background. I spent the last 10 years before Synac at Domino's. I ran the instant response, critical investigations, pen testing. Somehow I owned AppSec at the end. After this presentation, you'll see why. Really the goal here is to talk about that journey and to talk about building a program that's very compliance focused and moving into something that is the things that we always talk about, right? Like we always talk about we want to shift left. We always want to have this DevSecOps thing that people sell us. I'm a customer at heart. I'm a bad salesperson. So I'll try to make this as customer focused as possible. Feel free to interrupt, feel free to ask questions. I'd much prefer it that way. That way it's more entertaining for everybody. Cool? Yes? Sorry, I can hear it. All right. All right, it's all good. So, it was an interesting place. When I started 10 years ago, 12 years ago now, online ordering was outsourced. It was run by a third party. It was not the code. It wasn't code we owned or developed. And it was not great. We got a new CISO. CIO. He decided, hey, we're going to bring all this in-house. We're going to develop all this. We're going to build this huge infrastructure. And that's kind of when the transformation began to occur. We started building things like APIs, and we started building the platform in a very extensible way. The challenge with that is security was 3 people. So Steve Rudolph over there, I used to work with him. Actually, he interviewed me. And the issue is that we were ill prepared for where we were. And in that journey, we really had a program that was designed around compliance. It was very much check the box. It was, hey, we're going to company, they're going to do some stuff for us, and maybe we'll get something we won't. Developers did not enjoy us. We were the enemy in most companies. We were real big on paying for multiple week engagements. We'd give a company a bunch of money. They'd do a test. We get ho-hum results. And we wanted to change that. We weren't really happy with it. We kind of looked at each pen test, and it wasn't great. So what we kind of learned from that is cookie tests never improve anything. Like, it's just a checkbox. It isn't necessarily an experience that improved the business. It didn't move us forward. It didn't make executives feel comfortable. It didn't really grow the security program. But also we learned the level of engagement you have in your pen test equals the quality of the test. If you pay a company to walk in and do work for you, that's what you're getting. You're getting their attention span for as long as they have it, and that's it. And most pen test companies, if you're not familiar with the industry, what happens is you go onto a pen test engagement, they're working on your engagement, and at night, they're basically writing the report for the previous engagement. And it is this vicious cycle. That's why pen testers essentially go through like a 2 to 3 year cycle when they work for a company. It burns them out. And that's the quality you get. We did a lot of things where we'd make friends with them and we'd try to improve the relationship so we'd get something better. But we learned that it was just kind of the same thing over and over. How company scope really tells you what you're going to get. If they haven't done any due diligence, if they haven't done any preloading before they get to you, then they're flying blind. They're literally calling you to get information to figure out how your application or your system or environment works. If they don't come to you with a plan, then basically it's whatever you tell them in that 20-minute call, and that's what they're going to deliver. And no reports. I can't tell you how many awesome pen test reports where like they did lots of bad things, and I won't get into detail because obviously I don't work for Domino's anymore, but you know, like you find things. It's the nature of pen testing. No one reads it. No one cares. Like they appreciate a shock and awe story. They appreciate a discussion, but they forget. And that pen test report gets converted into an Excel spreadsheet, and that is the life cycle. And it is a discussion point in a meeting, and they say, well, where are we at in the status of this? Oh, okay, we haven't done what we needed to. Let's move to the next one. That is pen test life cycle. So from there, we kind of said, you know what? We just need to do this differently. At the time, I had talked my boss into just like, I'm like, just give me the pile of money and I will solve problem. I will meet all your requirements. Maybe I'm a better salesman than I realized. It wasn't a small chunk of change, let's put it that way. So we kind of went with the boutique route. And what we learned from the boutique route was, it was a great experience. We got guys who were quick and nimble and cheap. Like, it was awesome. Like, we would literally point them at anything we wanted to, and they would just beat it to death, give us a report. It was probably the best dollar per hour we ever could have gotten. The challenge with that is it's 1 or 2 guys, and it's limited understanding of technology, especially when you start looking at big applications like a PeopleSoft or an SAP or something that's kind of like, you know, yes, it's commonplace in enterprise, but it's not really commonplace from a code perspective and how it functions. There's a limited understanding there. Certainly more prone to bumps in the road. The story I always tell about using boutique firms is I had a situation where I had an overeager SOC, and I don't want to say they hacked the pen tester, but they were a little bit more aggressive in investigation, and they really upset the pen tester, and we didn't hear from them for like 4 weeks. And it wasn't a great experience. And it kind of taught us that maybe this wasn't the best way. When the majority of my time was spent kind of like general contracting we got a better result, but it wasn't necessarily a good mixture of time. So what I learned from this, though, is you have to think outside the box. Companies will deliver you like, hey, we're going to do a pen test for you, and this is what we think it should look like. And the reality is that doesn't fit for your organization. This is why organizations have discussions around build versus buy all the time, right? Do I buy it? Do I build it? And at some point it's like, yeah, we need to build it. But the problem is a lot of times as customers, we're not always actively engaging in that discussion. We're not saying, hey, this is what I need. Not what you've scoped out for me. I need something different or better. And having that discussion and being an active participant changes your experience. Big names don't always mean better. I have used the Big Four. I've used companies that you saw on the other slide. I've used all different kinds of companies in my career. And some of the best pen testers I saw and I had experiences with were smaller firms. Because they were smart. They didn't have the life cycle of the pen test, the pen tester where it was this constant rolling of one. Yeah, don't ever hack the pen tester. Terrible idea. Funny in hindsight and a really good bar story, but not something I would ever recommend. And always kind of be active in your pen test. Don't just pay the money and say, hey, you're going to give me a result and walk away. You're going to get exactly what you paid for, which is they're going to drop a report, they're going to hack the same things that the last guy hacked. It's not going to necessarily give you what you want. So the year after, we went after something different. I realized that through the pen test process, we were doing a disservice to the SOC. We were beating the hell out of them. We were literally just going crazy. We were finding all the bad things. They were chasing themselves. And I wanted to improve the process. So one of the things is we created a red-blue team. But what we did was a little bit different. We embedded a blue team or an incident response team within the SOC, but we didn't tell them. Which, again, hindsight probably was not the best for my relationship, but at the end of the day, it created an interesting experience. And it was about creating a different pen test experience to improve the program. We also stopped announcing pen test engagements. If you've done a pen test over the years, you find that everybody and their brother finds something wrong that is totally unrelated to the pen test that is now your problem, and you must go solve it. Because the CEO's mouse stopped working and it must have been a pen tester, even though he just didn't change the batteries for 6 months, right? Like that's the life cycle. And what I found was that the business cared about pen testing, but they only cared as much as they wanted nothing bad to happen. And in building the program, one of the things I realized that as long as I built trust with the organization and I helped them understand that my goal is to protect the organization, but to find the things, then as long as I keep them safe, then I'll never hear from them again. And they were cool with that. It's like, okay. Now, I also realized I was also putting my job on the line, which, when I'm young, it's okay, right? Like, I didn't have anything to worry about. With the red-blue team concept, when we embedded the SOC, we basically planted them as auditors. We said, hey, we got an audit team coming in. They're here to monitor you. They're here to see your performance and things like that. It's something internal audit asked for. And I think we made up some company they were from. And it worked for about 2 or 3 days until they started cackling, after they pivoted into the network and did different things. And, the guys would ask specific questions about specific attacks, and it got further than it needed to. That said, what we learned from that experience, though, is the SOC took it as an opportunity to learn to track. They weren't typically great at it in the past. And all I really did to do this was I scoped down the number of weeks with the pen test company, and I added more headcount, but I added IR headcount. And that changed the dynamic of an internal pen test. And it really kind of brought a different experience where not only were we testing the environment, but we're helping the SOC be better at their job. And that changed the dynamic. So what I learned from this is vendors will do anything you want. When I first went to Rapid7, the company I started it with, they were like, yeah, what do you want? We're not going to do that. And I'm like, yes, you will. If you want my money, if you want my contract, you will build this. The irony of this is I won an award for the idea, and then I think they sell this all the time all over the place, which is great, right? Because I think more companies need to do it. Unique doesn't mean expensive. I took something that I used to pay for, I'd pay for 2 head count for, 4 weeks, and I said, okay, I'm gonna pay for 4 head count for, 2 weeks or 1 week, right? Like I shifted the dollars in the way of how I was billed to better understand, you know what? I can get more value of helping the SOC and doing a pen test, but just maybe I do the scoping or the recon, right? Like I changed the rules of the game. I said, you know what? I don't want to pay you for recon anymore. I'll give you the recon, right? So that way you change the dynamic of, look, I'll preload you with all the information you need so that way I'm not paying you to do that recon. And any information you want to discover through the process, I'll tell you as long as it's publicly available. And it changed the scope of the engagement where we weren't spending time on that recon process. We were getting the real testing and we were getting the help, the support the SOC needed. Yeah, be agile when things go sideways. There was an issue with a Polycom in an executive office and an OS 365 account that wasn't two-factored with high-profile people, and I had to recover very quickly. My week for red team, blue team, like that was my thing. Like I was always bouncing around, making sure that nothing fell apart. I didn't just sit in my desk and like do other work. I was basically like, look, this is what's going on, and until I trust the resources I'm using, then like this is it. Because I want that engagement to go like great, and because I want that freedom. Like in the end of the day, I need engagements to go well, so the business gives me more freedom to do other crazy things. Executives love shock and awe. There is a story where me and another individual cloned executive badges. We were walking around with a Proxmark. You guys familiar with Proxmark? Yes, no. Device that clones HID badges. We were walking around and we cloned badges. We cloned executive badges. They loved it. Like, we would always do things like that weren't a ton of money, but added to the value of the story we were building. We were making the environment more secure by saying, hey, you know what, we need $1,000. Right, we need $1,000, a couple of hours, we'll build this, on our own time at home. And it allows us to build that culture of security. Right? Like it's not just about like, who am I gonna hire, what tool am I gonna hire? We're building a story in the business. We want them to feel like, hey, these are vulnerabilities. This is how we did it. Even when we did red team, blue team engagements, we always built a story around it. How did they get in? What was the path? What did they know? We're building that story so it allowed the business to kind of say, okay, yeah, this is realistic, or no, that could never happen, right? Like we needed them to be in that mind space. Text for blind engagements. The red team, blue team thing was bad. Like we made up the auditor thing like on the fly. It didn't go well. Kind of finding the right partners. So what we learned was, we all like to just have one throat to choke. Like that's the nature of like security and tooling, and the reality is it doesn't always work that way. What we kind of found out is red team, blue team engagements, guys needed to be on site. We needed guys who had IR experience. We needed pen testers who were all about internal moving and pivoting. Like it was a different mindset. The minute we went to the web, it was the same cookie cutter pen test over and over. And that drove us nuts. Because the truth of the matter is we just, no matter how many resources we would throw at a particular asset, we couldn't get the coverage we wanted. So, interesting, fun story. I had heard about Synac, so this is the ish sales pitch, right? So I had heard about Synac while I was at Black Hat, and I had heard it in the sense of monetizing bug bounty or crowdsource. Like I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. Like that's a different way to test. My CISO at the time said, I heard about Synac from a CISO meeting I was at with like PepsiCo. I was like, oh, okay, that's kind of cool, right? Like, that's a different way to do it. So him and I went to the CIO, who we both worked for. We said, hey, we want to do this. He says, no way. He says, you've lost your mind. You are not bringing a bunch of these random people in here to attack us. It's just not going to happen. And through some discussions, we basically said, hey, just give us a shot. Like, let us try it. This is a new concept. We're not getting the results we need. We're not moving the mark on testing. And he says, okay, but if you fail, it's you. It's on you. So he basically told me, he says, well, if this goes poorly, you'll find another job. And that was okay. So the interesting thing is we brought them in, we brought CSA in, and we had a great experience. We had a great experience because we had a diverse mindset. They did not blow up the app like they had thought they would. But the reality was that we were a harder target. We knew we were. We sent them a target that was hardened. And that kind of changed our perspective. They had found vulns. I mean, we had probably spent over 6 or 7 figures on testing online ordering. Like, we had spent a significant amount of money, and it was the same pen test over and over. So we were dying for something else. And CSA had found vulns that we just didn't realize, we didn't understand. Developers had just forgotten about things that were tech debt, and it changed how we looked at this. So my quick CSA speech is this is the architecture. So it starts with the red team. The CSA red team are researchers who are contracted by CSA, who are vetted, their background checks, they're all that, and they go through LaunchPoint. LaunchPoint is a secure VPN. That VPN basically funnels all their traffic down to a single or a grouping of IP addresses, and then you can let them in to go after certain assets. This was great for us because the way we wanted to test without additional controls. We couldn't test in production because whether you realize it or not, losing orders in production websites, especially for a pizza company, is really bad. Like someone goes somewhere else. Like if you can't hit order, you guys all know this, right? You want a pizza, if the button doesn't work, you called the next company. Like there is no loyalty. The ease is the loyalty. Like if I can hit that button, I'm gonna keep doing that over and over. What we did is we started testing in pre-prod. We tested without WAF controls, without the normal controls, because we wanted that raw experience. We wanted to know, look, if the WAF fails because too much traffic, or if a secondary control fails, what do we do, right? The answer is there's nothing. You sit there, you wait until the attack's over, you do the incident response, and you write the report. So we wanted that raw experience. Excuse me. Being able to funnel them through this process made it really easy for us. We added them, they were able to go at the website, they produced results for us. The interesting part of this process for us was that somebody viewed every vuln before we saw it. So CSA has an operations team. And this is probably the biggest challenge I had in my pen testing career, or my security career, was companies delivered me results, and I'd have to deal with the output, right? Like that's the hard part. I always say the last mile is the hard part. Doing the pen test, everybody and their brother can do. Getting the results into your organization, getting them to where the business cares, that's the difficult part. So because they've got an operations team, that kind of makes it easier. Also, there's a remediation process, or a patch verification process, sorry. So when my development teams fix something, they could hit a button and the researcher would go out and verify that it was fixed. So we got out of the business of looking at every vulnerability after the patch and the update. And it changed how we did business. It changed how many tests we could execute. It changed our relationship with developers because we could basically go, here's the results, go fix them, and they would go do their thing. The results were written well enough and they could understand there were steps to reproduce, that they were able to do what they needed to do. We didn't have to hold their hand and have that discussion of, yes, this is really bad, yes, you should fix it. There were videos, there were ways for people to understand the concept. So, be agile when things go sideways. As you start scaling, things go sideways very quickly. I want to say that first year with CSA, we executed 12 one-week tests, or 2-week tests, sorry. I think the next year we did like 26 and kept going. But we'll kind of talk about that. People get scared of the crowd. Initially, Domino's is a very I don't want to say old organization, but very conservative organization, like most Midwestern companies, right? Like it's something we all deal with. You go and drop a weird concept on the table, like, nope, that's scary, please get rid of that, right? Like, but once we got people comfortable with the concept and said, look, how is this any different than, us hiring someone like a consultant and having them do it? There's still a background check, there's still a risk they could leak something, those risks still exist. And the business got more comfortable as time went on to the point where people started requesting it, and it changed the discussion. Get buy-in from developers. This is my biggest thing. I'm a boots on the ground guy. Like I want to go low. I want to get approval from leadership, make sure they're on board. And I want to go low to developers, and I say, tell me why you hate this. Because at the end of the day, they're the customer. They're the ones who are going to tell you it's bad, and then go to their leadership and tell them it's bad, and then you hear it from the top. And at that point, you're done. Because the leadership's going to say, well, go make your internal customers happy. And if you didn't make them happy, your game's over. You go back and forth and say, well, but we looked through the results. They looked okay. Well, we found this false positive, so we don't want to see any of this data anymore. Right? Like, going to them early and getting buy-in early changes the discussion, changes the dynamic. Run your program, don't let it run you. As you scale, as you test, it can get difficult, right? Because as you do all these things, like this is a whole story, right? The whole thing is the company begins to want security. Like it changes the discussion. We all fight with this problem of you get 5 minutes when something bad happens, and if you don't use those 5 minutes appropriately, you're done, right? Like that's it. So you have to use discussion to help build a culture where they want testing, they see good results. You have discussions of, oh, hey, we found this really bad thing. Do you think we should fix it? Oh yeah, we should fix that. What could happen if that got out in the wild? This and that. Oh yeah, we should fix that. But because we got developers in early, they were our advocates for us. Half the time we would just sit in the meeting. Developers would have a conversation with leadership. Yeah, you should fix that. Security says this is really important. And they would do all the bargaining for us. It changes the dynamic. All right, pen test everything. So then we went into continued red blue. We started doing full blinds. We did a huge growth of SYNAC where we started testing everything public facing. Anything that went on the internet got tested by SYNAC. And that changed culture. That changed how we made decisions in the business. Marketing got riskier and started doing, hey, we want to do this crazy thing. We're like, okay. We were able to execute pen testing a lot faster because of the process. And I didn't really talk about it, but I don't know if we have time, but we rolled out things like responsible disclosure. We rolled out store testing. And a lot of it had to do with, we got to a place where web testing is probably the biggest concern in an organization, at least in my opinion. And a lot of it has to do with because there's so much unknown. You've got so many people developing code. Hosts, in the end of the day, it's got a port open, it's got a bad service you got to patch, you patch it, you move on, right? Web testing, it's a ball of wax. Having too many pen tests can be a bad thing. We had so many results, we had so many pen tests going at once. The thing that worked really well for us, we started integrating SYNAC into the process, where we started using like Jira. So we were pushing vulns into developers. We were pushing them downstream. And we kind of got out of that. That said, not every group used SYNAC, or not every group used Jira. So like when HR teams and we started doing third-party testing, vulns didn't work that way. So it got a little harder to move things around. That said, you got to be able to manage something like this. I think, I think when the program I think is still running about 26 continuous tests. That's 365 days a year, continually testing every app, just everything public facing. And what the kind of the thing that's not in this, but the thing we learned is we bought time for the SOC. We bought time for other teams. We were hardening that exterior that bought other teams time to grow up. And it's the castle mentality, right? Like, I've got this thing that's bad. I build a moat around it, I build a wall, I bought time to fix my internal things. And that was very much the path we were going down. We kind of realized it after the fact that we really built a comprehensive program. We started having all these pieces where we were dropping devices in stores, we were dropping devices in supply chains. Like, we changed how we did testing. Because how we were utilizing Synac, it kind of did its thing. And then we were able to take internal resources and other companies and test the other things that are like stores, supply chains, things that have risk, that are often hard to digest. If you have more than one location, you realize at some point corporate's very easy. It's the other buildings that you go, oh wow, that's really bad. And we were able to do a lot with that. The other thing I will tell you is, and it was on the other slide, but I didn't mention it, responsible disclosure. I don't care who you spend money with, you need responsible disclosure. From my time in managing IR, I managed so many incidents where companies poorly managed someone coming to them and saying, hey, we found something bad. Find someone. We sell a product that does responsible disclosure. It's included if you buy a certain level of testing, but just put a responsible disclosure page up. You need to funnel your external friends into a place where you can control and manage the message. I had a lot of trouble, even with the master franchisee model, where everybody and their brother would start responding to security events, and they wouldn't respond in an appropriate way, and it would go sideways really fast. So being able to manage responsible disclosure, being able to manage giving people a thoughtful way to say that you have a security vulnerability from a public perspective is really valuable. And it can stop a lot of problems early. The program beyond, we were starting to build automated red-blue. We started shifting into purple, where we're combining the red and the blue. Right? Like that's the dream we all have. Doesn't always work very well. After you make the SOC unhappy, like multiple times a year, it doesn't go well. So it's a relationship, and honestly, it's probably my biggest failure in building program, is that I was too eager to be the red team guy, and I didn't think enough about the blue side. I didn't integrate them as well as they should have, and I think there's a lot of value in that, right? Like, it's important for those teams to work together, and for the blue team to have a win, because oftentimes they don't. We started using Synac for continuous testing for third parties. Third party, there's risk. It's hard to identify a third party risk. Make sure you have legal, security riders in all your agreements, so you have the ability to at least do audit. They have insurance. Like, cover your end. Because I can't tell you how many times I've had a third party who was like, hey, we had a breach. You're like, hey, let's talk about that. Oh, no, we can't talk about it. I'm like, but we have this contract. They're like, oh yeah, it doesn't say anything about that. We don't have to talk to you. It's like, oh. So then everybody had riders, right? Like, every time a renewal came in, you get a rider, everybody gets a rider. So that way we had the ability to audit, we had the ability to pen test. We knew they had at least $1 million in cybersecurity insurance. We knew that they had a dedicated resource that was responsible for cybersecurity. Like, we changed the discussion because we want to stop problems. And I know this all sounds far-fetched for a pizza company, but at the end of the day, we were protecting a brand, right? Like, that's what Domino's protects. The Domino's security team is awesome. Those guys are great. The hard part for them is they're protecting a brand, and brands are often harder to protect than physical locations. Because at least you can say, okay, we're gonna put a wall up, we're gonna put a fence, we're gonna put cameras. The brand, some random store employee does something dumb, and now you've got an attack on the brand, and how do you deal with that? So kind of the end, like, key takeaways, pen testing's never over. It is a journey. We like to think we do a test. If you're doing one test a year, it's not enough. PCI, I think it's two times a year now. But the reality is you need to do, your landscape changes daily. Developers are doing different things. You have infrastructure guys who are making changes to firewalls, upgrading code. Your landscape changes daily, maybe more than that. If you're not thinking about testing those changes, and not everybody does. Let's be honest. No one does testing as probably as much as they need to. Right? It's just the nature of the beast. You only have so much money, you only have so much time, and you have to be able to scope it appropriately. The closer you can act as an attacker, the better. The reality is, attackers don't care. There are no rules in this game. I can do whatever I want to you and say, hey, have a nice day. I can take down your organization and not care. And that's just the reality of the world. And we need to think about that as we design testing. We need to be prepared for what these people are going to throw at us. More viewpoints, the better. You know, you get one guy who comes to your engagement and he knows PHP, or there's one guy I love. He is the master of printers. And he's been on our engagement and he's been great. But that's his forte. That's what he knows. You put a web app in front of him, sometimes he's like, let me think about it, right? But you get a young guy who's like, I know this web app, I know React, I'm just gonna beat it up. 10 minutes, he's done. It's the same for anything, right? Like, we all have specialties. So having more opinions, more viewpoints on an application that you're testing or a system that you're testing, the better you are to find the results you want. Attackers only need it once. Get creative. The internal message is the big part. In the end of the day, we are just here to make the business happy and feel secure. The way they feel secure is that you feel like you've answered their needs and their concerns. And building something that they feel is comprehensive may feel difficult, but believe it or not, it's just a matter of just taking the time and building it. I think we did this over probably about 4 or 5 years. It wasn't instant. It didn't happen in the first day or the first year. We had failures, let's call them. We had incidents, but you know, we made it work. And it's not impossible, but it's about building that culture and building that kind of that process. That's what I got, unless you guys got questions. Yes, ma'am. Is software development a part of third-party risk? Is that your question?
Software bill of material, SBOMs.
SBOMs. In the end of the day, you don't control that end to end, right? So it really depends on how your organization manages that risk, right? And I would say most companies aren't that granular. They are still focused on, we're working with Bob, we're working with, you know, this company, and what's their risk? I think it's a maturity thing, to be honest with you, and from my opinion, for whatever it's worth. I think it's hard. I think third-party risk is hard. I think some of the opportunities and offerings in the market don't always make it easier. But in my mind, if it doesn't live in your environment and you don't control its development, its life cycle, and end to end, then it's a third party. And you need to understand that risk. In my experience, at Domino's doing third party risk, and even at Synac, talking to customers daily, I would say that no one does a great job with third party risk. It's either paperwork, or, well, it's paperwork, head in the sand, or some robust process that nobody finishes every vendor every year. So. Yes, sir.
So I like your point about choosing the right partner coupled with Midwest views on being adverse to change, right? Doing something differently. I feel like a lot of times some of the pen tests are pushed by internal audit using firms that have board recognition already. And many times those firms don't know the difference between a pen test and a vulnerability assessment. What tips and tricks have you used in the past to kind of get companies to understand the difference between what they're getting?
How do I put this nicely? You know, I have been the subject of many internal audit pen tests, and I think it's just the nature of working in security. What I've always found is you need to build a program that's defensible, right? The challenge here is, if you're building or you have to present the same thing that they're going to do to you, then it's hard to defend. I always presented Synac, like when they would come in and say, hey, tell me about your pen test program, I'm like, we got red team, blue team, we got Synac. And they'd be like, okay. And I said, well, this is how we structure red team, blue team, this is what we do with Synac. And we had many third-party audits where like, yeah, we're good. Like internal audit would be like, hey, this is gonna be like a 6-day thing, and we're gonna rip apart every piece of methodology, and we're gonna do all these things. We were able to change the game. Even with PCI, every PCI QSA, and we would always choose different ones. Like I would literally roll up, log into Synac portal, show them the portal, say, hey, this is where we tested this is where we tested that. You got questions? Well, where's your open this and that? We'd show them, they go, okay. And that was it. I mean, I was in there 10 minutes. And it was like that year after year, because we were able to show a comprehensive program. The challenge here is oftentimes we present the same reports that they're gonna produce, right? So internal audit feels like this isn't what we need it to be. So I always go back to if you're at a large enough company and you're getting those audits and things like that, then you need to build something that kind of blows them out of the water. My former boss always used to tell me, build it securely, and you get the compliance like as part of the process, rather than kind of just driving towards compliance. Because at some point, compliance is great and it's awesome, but the challenge is it doesn't always mean you're secure. Like it's an important part, and I say this, it's ironic I say this, because at some point in my career, I'm like, I don't need compliance. Like policy guys, I don't need those guys anymore. And as I grew into my career, I was like, yeah, like I was missing something completely here. And I realized how important policy and compliance was. But I also realized later on that I was building what they wanted, I just needed to present it to them in a way that they could digest it. Yes, ma'am.
So vulnerability assessment and test differences, great. But what's the difference of penetration testing versus cybersecurity? Is that a solution? See that as a solution?
I think it depends on how you structure your breach simulations. Red team, blue teams, we were structuring them essentially as live fire breach simulations. Not every company is ready for that. There is a lot of trust that security needs to have. There is a lot of, the business as a whole needs to trust, all of it. Because when you start saying, hey, we're gonna drop a pen tester in, and they're just gonna go wild. Hey, we're gonna drop some malware and just see what happens. That's a rough conversation if you went from compliance to hey, breach simulation. Pen testing in my mind can be lots of things. We sold Red Blue because it was easier than selling breach simulation. Where we used breach simulation was more around the tabletop model. We used it with executives, we used it with engineers, and I always will tell you that you should have separate meetings. And eventually, as you mature, they should feed into each other. Because executives will make interesting choices that, and even the same hand. It was funny, one year we pulled out, we had an engineering tabletop, but we pulled out all the figureheads, all the important, the people that are loud and speak up. I wasn't one of them, I swear. But maybe I was. We pulled out all the people that were kind of the ones who would speak up, and it changed the simulation. People were like, yeah, well, we'd call this, or we'd open a ticket. We're like, well, what's the IR plan say? And they had all read it. So I think they're all tools, and you just need to decide what tool is important to where your organization is. That's the reality, right? We're sold, this is gonna solve the world problem, and the reality is it depends on where you are in that journey. That's the important part of the equation. So if you have a mature environment, breach simulation. Just drop it out there, let it go, awesome. But if your organization has never done it before, they don't understand it, and you say that, you basically just it's gonna be like deer in headlights. You're gonna be like, you've lost your mind. So I think it's really important to use the right tool for the right job. Sorry, I know that's a really long-winded answer. Anything else, guys? I'll sit here and tell lies all night, I swear. All right, guys. Appreciate the time.
back at it.
Thanks, guys.
Testing 1, 2.
All right. Ready to pick back up? Wow, bright. All right, so can I be? I can hear me. Is it, testing, testing. There we go. We'll do it. We'll see if it keeps cutting out. I might do that. All right, or maybe it's better here. I'll just stand right here. All right, so we're gonna get going. So our next sponsor, Cyrus. Again, appreciate it. Without the sponsors, these things don't happen. So really appreciate the sponsorship. And would you like to kick it off, or Dave? Dave's gonna kick it off for us.
How about now? All right. The sweet dulcet tones of Dave Glenn. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight, and thank you for giving some of your time to us. Really looking forward to our discussion. You all know Eric Willey, CISO for American Axle Manufacturing, and then Robert Hill is the CEO of Cyrus, which is the company that I work for. And there's many of you that are familiar faces to me, and some of you that I don't know. So I'm looking forward to making the acquaintance of those of you that I don't know. So Cyrus is a market-leading continuous compliance and cyber risk management platform. And we all know that it's increasingly challenging and difficult to manage the burden of regulatory compliance, frameworks, all the requirements of the boards, your third-party risk situations. So what our platform does is it provides real-time insight that makes cyber risk management much less complex. And so we have very broad support of different compliance management frameworks and regulatory frameworks. Robert, would you like to quickly share the origin story of Cyrus, then we'll get into the business discussion with Eric. Quickly.
Okay, he does say quickly, because sometimes I get a little bit long-winded on these things. Okay, guys, much of what the previous speaker was talking about, sounds like I am going in and out here. I don't want to do that much. So many times we have gone back to senior leadership and we've talked about compliance. We're trying to sell FUD to additional funding. We rely on once a year. I want to have switched the mic. Let me have the handheld. Technical difficulties here, guys. How about that one? And so we
Much
rely
better.
on these once-a-year assessments. And when a company comes in, they look at everything that's going on, and then you have a 1 year or 12 months before they come back and do it again. And how can you make decisions based on a visibility of once every year? And what we did is as a consulting company, we realized that this wasn't effective. Not only was it not effective, it was very difficult to manage many customers with many different compliances because we were all doing it in spreadsheets. So how many of y'all love managing compliance on these really complicated spreadsheets? Come on, I mean, let's see everybody's
got a
hands
couple
go
of
up.
yeses.
Yeah, I was waiting to see Brian's hand.
Let me ask a different question. How many of you have a way to manage very complex compliance other than an Excel spreadsheet? Well, again, very few hands go up. And so that's what we did. Cyrus is the evolution of what we call that next generation risk management platform. And that is not changing. We'll talk more about it, but what we really wanted to do this evening was give Eric a chance to talk about what we were able to do with American Axle, our partnership with American Axle, and what we were able to help them accomplish in looking at that real-time visibility, looking at that cyber maturation as a service, looking at being able to overlay various compliance, but instead of looking at it once a year, instead of having to have auditors come in and, as you say, take the bandwidth of your very limited resources and do this repetitively for each different set of auditors, now there's a visibility, now there's a lens, now there's the way of being able to not only look at those as that maturity improves, but being able to do so in a business language that allows senior leadership to also have that visibility month over month, quarter over quarter, not just year over year.
Thank you, Robert. And again, thank you for spending this time with us. I would hazard to guess that many of you have to deal with at least one regulatory compliance mandate. How many of you deal with more than 2 regulatory compliance mandates? More than 3? 4? 5? Yeah, so Stephen wins the prize for the most there. It's fun when you really drill into it. You know, there's a GLB safeguards rule that goes into effect on December 9th, and I was shocked at how many organizations actually fit a financial services model, car dealerships and things like that. So it's become this alphabet soup of compliance mandates. In terms of compliance mandates, what is American Axle subject to? What stands out as being particularly difficult?
Yeah, so I think my mic's working now. See, I said I was an AV guy, not a good AV guy, so I just can't move from this spot, and we'll see if it keeps working. So from a framework perspective, so we're not subject to a lot of regulatory, it's not pushed by government mandates or anything like that, but what you have is, within automotive in general, you have a lot of the OEMs that have started to look at the supply chain and realize how critical all of the different companies are, right? I mean, take Toyota, for instance, and look at how many of their different partners have disrupted their overall supply chain. So what you're seeing in automotive is everybody's starting to audit their suppliers, and everybody has their own framework. So, and it's all, I mean, if you look at it, there are a lot of the shared questions, a lot of it based off of NIST. You can get kind of a, ISO, all kinds of different things in there. I think that it's a little bit different as you think about TISAX and the German automotive manufacturers. Now there's talk about that starting to flow over into the US and the Detroit 3 picking that up. But if you think about how many different OEMs there are, each one of them having their own, asking us, hey, can you go through all of these different security questions? We want to know about your overall maturity. It becomes a lot. And is exactly what you said, that we were spending so much time just responding to all those different audits. There had to be kind of a more efficient way to do it.
Cool. So what made you think about looking for a risk management platform? When you set out, what were your objectives? What were you thinking about? And what was the business asking you to do?
Yeah, so I think fundamentally, philosophically, you have to think about put it in the context of compliance. And Ron kind of mentioned that, originally early in his career that, we don't need compliance. In a lot of organizations, I think compliance becomes kind of a very binary element, that it's, you have this control, you don't have this control, and it becomes almost a perfunctory exercise, right? That you go through, check it off, yeah, we got it here. Here's our certification, we're good here.
Leave us alone for a year and come back.
Right,
Or 3 years.
right. And that, my viewpoint on compliance is, I think, number one, it can be a baseline to grow off of, but it can also be a good way to show the maturity of the organization, not only internally thinking about being able to push that up to the board, but as well as external customers. It's a way to, lack of better terms, to show off, right, on what you're doing as an organization. And if you can move away from some of those binary controls and actually do risk-based scoring on what is the actual risk specifically, rather than looking at yes, no on technical controls, but looking at the risk inherent in business processes. If you think about you've mentioned all the time that it's good people doing good things versus kind of a documented, repeatable process are very different things, but a lot of the frameworks don't get into that. So by virtue of being able to do some of that risk scoring, we can now show the maturity growth over time, which plays very well with the board, and showing them that, hey, we made the investments on these efforts and building out this documentation, these processes, and it got us to this additional score, and then ultimately some of the risk offsets.
Is it easy to document all this stuff? Is it pretty simple? Stacks of spreadsheets?
Everybody loves documentation, right? So yeah, it's totally easy. Yeah, technical people are great at writing documentation. No, it's tough, but it's, at the end of the day, Ron used a defensible program. It's part of that. You have to have that to have a defensible program. If you don't have documentation around it, do you really have a process? No. You've got to practice, right? So it's a critical element, unfortunately.
And I want to build a little bit on that. So many times, and this is Ron, this is back to some of the things that you were talking about, so many times there is a technical control. And a year ago when we were starting going down this was a conversation you and I had, where there is a control that says, do you do this, yes or no? Well, it's okay to check the box and say, yes, you do. But have you assigned somebody? How often do they look at it? Are you monitoring it? Is there a contingency plan? Are there adequate resources? Are they skilled in doing that? And so there's all of these business questions that need to be asked beyond just that simple control. And so the frameworks a lot of times look at that control, yes or no, but it doesn't look at the business side of being able to, not only do you have that control, is it sustainable? Are you able to maintain that for that 12-month, 24-month, 36-month that you have to?
Right. Well, it's, Mark and I were just talking about, does anybody work for Kronos in here? All right, good. So if you go back to last year, and for those of you who know Kronos, is time and attendance. If I recall correctly, I think they had ISO 27001 and SOC 2 report, and they still had a major breach. And anybody who was running their application was spent a lot of time doing manual time and attendance. It was painful. But you think about it, that comes back to one of the underlying issues with some of the frameworks. That yes, I was able to check it off. Here's my sheet of paper that says I'm compliant, therefore go away, don't ask me any more questions, but doesn't actually get into the maturity of the business processes underlying it and the actual risk to the organization using their service.
There's been some recent news that pragmatically, I think, impacts the need for documentation in a significant way. And I don't know how far down that rabbit hole we want to go, but if you all think about how things have changed with Uber CISO and different challenges in that respect, we're seeing a lot of conversations with people where you really have to rethink insurance. You really have to rethink if I'm a CISO, if I'm a security VP and I've got this responsibility, then how should I document that so that 7 years from now I don't get into hot water with things that are business practices. Anyway, tell us about selecting a platform. Like what were some of the things you ran into? What were, as you thought about requirements for something, for a platform, what was important to you? What is important to you? And what are some of the things that drove you to that?
Yeah, and I'm gonna steal from Ron yet again on thinking differently. There's a lot of GRC platforms out there, and they kind of harken back to just the binary elements of having a control, not having a control. And for us, we wanted to use compliance as a stepping stone to show our maturity growth over time. So that means that it had to drive back to what is the maturity built into the actual process behind the control, process behind what we're doing from a given security element. So that was kind of the guiding tenet of what we were looking for. Plus, one of the big elements, again, and I'll go back to what I was saying about the suppliers or the OEMs on all the different security frameworks, the ability to map between all of those different frameworks is super, super critical, right? Because even if I implemented a traditional GRC tool, a lot of times you're still going through, all right, I got to do it for NIST, I got to do it for this ISO 27001, I got to do it for this framework. You're still doing it for each one of those frameworks. But if you think about it, think about how many of those controls are actually shared across all of those different frameworks. And if you could find a way to pull the majority of those controls together, answer them once, and then just reorder them for each of the different frameworks to be able to show how you're compliant against it, that becomes a huge competitive advantage when you're trying to win business.
And then let's expand that a little further in your specific example. TISAX, you've got plants all over the world. And so we just finished engagement with 5 of those of the first start. Some of those, at a corporate level, you take care of those for all of them. But others, they're individual physical security as an example. Mm-hmm. They're individuals based on where that plant is located.
Right.
And there's different levels of maturity. So how, outside of a separate spreadsheet for every one of those plants, were you intending to do that? And then we can talk a little bit about how you now do that.
Outside of a tool that can actually think in those dynamics, I'll just say painful. That'd be, yeah, because if you think about 70 locations and kind of running those controls for each one, it's not sustainable. And that was one of the key things, specifically on TISAX, that we were able to do. As we think about it, I think we boiled it down to individual, there ended up being like 200 controls, somewhere, give or take. And because we were able to think in the context of how the organization is actually structured, that you have the majority of the controls that exist at the corporate level, and then each of the sites are only responsible for these elements. I think we boiled it down to 15 controls that we had to worry about for each of the sites. So if you think about the scope and going through TISAX, rather than going through all 200 plus controls at every single site, we're able to boil it down and say, no, you just got to worry about these 15 here, and it makes it much quicker, much more efficient to be able to iterate through them.
And from a business perspective, it's a lot less expensive.
Yes.
Because, bring up, one of the big four that's involved in this that was brought in. That would be that times 70-something places.
Right.
And now it is, it's these 15 individual controls at these 70, not 248 across all of
Absolutely.
those.
Yeah, that's the ROI on it is pretty quick.
Robert, you brought up the big four. I want to back up for just a second and ask you, when you developed, when you had this idea for Saturis, why? This is the reason I'm here. So talk a little bit about what the frustration was and how this came to be.
All right, I'll talk a moment about that one. I'm actually going to bring up a slide because we've kind of jumped around a little bit here. The adaptive risk model is what we came up with years ago because there was this massive frustration around how do we adapt rapidly. If you're waiting on that annual basis, what about your environment changes? What about the architecture changes? What about new applications involved? You were talking about SBOMs earlier. We can talk about that in a few minutes when we start talking about third-party risk management. How do we rapidly adapt to these changes? And then you start looking at things like organizational adjustments. There's acquisitions, there's divestitures, there's mergers, there's executive changes. If you're only looking at this once a year, how do you adjust to that? And then there's business threats. You've got internal threats. We talked about the red teams. We talked about blue teams. We talked about the external threats. But you've got internal threats also. And so how do you react? Is it just a check the box of compliance, or are you building a program that's sustainable and you want to understand how rapidly you can adjust to those changing threats? So the first thing that any of the big four or anybody else that comes and does assessment is this idea of identification, where now you can establish a baseline. A lady and I were talking in line about establishing the baseline, understanding where you as an organization are at this point. Eric, I'm going to let you talk about that in a minute because the first thing we did was establish that baseline to understand where the organization is at a whole. Not a specific compliance, not looking at TISAX first, not looking at PCI first. Organizationally, how does this organization, what is the maturity? Where is the real picture today? Well, everyone wants to get that identification. They want to move directly to remediation. You find a gap, let's remediate it. You talked about that earlier. Here's all these things we fixed. Guys, that's not the next step. Let's measure that against potential business impact. That gap for your organization may be a very low risk, but for a sister organization or your next competitor down the street, it's a huge risk because their business model is different. So you have to be able to measure those findings against the delivery of those business services. And then, and only once you've measured that, can you begin to prioritize those. So now you know what are most risk impactful to the business. Now you can prioritize what everybody wants to get to is that remediation. And so now your remediation becomes very, very skilled. It becomes methodical. It becomes very calculated so that you're not just taking this huge list of findings and starting at the top, which how many of us successfully get a spreadsheet of findings and make it all the way to the bottom before the next assessment? Nobody. It's a broken model. It doesn't work. So now what you can do is you begin to prioritize that and you take out those things that are most impactful to the delivery of those business services. So Dave, to answer your question, what we do is take this adaptive risk model and apply this to every framework, whether it's TISAX, whether it's C2MA, no matter what that compliance is, by applying this model to it, you begin to get much more value.
Yeah, totally agreed. Now, for me, from my perspective, again, it lends itself well to talking with the board as well. And that's because as we can start thinking about the overall strategy as we go through, it's very easy as we walk back from the tactical to set objectives. We want to do this for the next year, but then backing that up to explaining, here's why we want to do these objectives, right? And this lends itself very well to, hey, I can show you all the different areas that we were assessed in the C2MA, and then show, all right, we were deficient in these areas, we're going to do these objectives, and by the way, it's going to raise the score by this many points going forward. So it really lends itself to show that, hey, it's not just throwing darts at the board on what objectives we're going to do. It ties back to an actual business risk.
And if you look at this graph that I've pulled up on the screen, this is an interesting graph because you're seeing month over month change. You're not seeing year over year. And all of a sudden, right here, you see this maturity drop. This organization closed 35,000 retail locations and laid off 75% of their resources during COVID. Their senior leadership came back and said, how badly did that affect us? Well, you can't tell that on a spreadsheet, especially on a year over year. But we were able to come back and say, this is what it did. Then their next question was, how do we do better? How do we improve that? And can you measure that improvement? So that's just one of the many variables that we're able to show in that.
I would 100% agree.
Eric, one of the things that I admire about you is that you connect well with the business. I watched you do that at Penske and now watching it at American Axle. And I applaud you for that. How easy is it to prove that your security purchases are returning on investment?
Yeah, generally speaking, that's never easy, right? Because it's dependent on the person. It's really, I would say for me, the biggest thing you have to do is listen, right? Every business is different. Every business leader is different in what they care about. Kind of going back to the board, right? If we were to go into the board and say, hey, we're doing this from this framework, the board doesn't care about frameworks unless that's going to differentiate an earning business, and that ties back to where the company is going. But now you start talking about generically risk, right? And business risk and protecting the organization, that becomes huge. So I think from my perspective, it's a lot of listening, understanding what actually resonates, and staying away from a lot of the technical jargon.
Nice, right? Thank you. Tell us about the process of baselining. So we started getting into that a little bit. How has that worked in the past for you? This time around, what lessons did you learn from that?
Yeah, I would say kind of in the past, baselining was always built on pick a framework, right? I always gravitated towards the CIS top 20, which is now the top 18, and that's kind of where we started. But again, it's kind of hearkening back to the different controls that are in there. And the CIS, not knocking the CIS at all, is a great framework. But if you think about it, there's no weighting for controls or anything like that. Everything's treated very linear, that every control is considered the same, and that's just not the way things work. See, I'm a bad AV guy again. I'm going to turn this way. So it was very difficult in the past to actually create an actual baseline that could exist across different frameworks and actually talk to the maturity of the organization. And that's really kind of, for me, where the C2MA, that's really what sold it. As we talked about it, that it was about looking at the maturity within the actual processes that we're doing each day.
And I think that's very important is while it's definitely necessary to have those controls, the technical controls, they have
Certainly.
to be there, they have to be in place. But how do you mature when all you're doing is checking boxes in front of the IT department?
Right.
How do you bring the other departments of the organization in to understand and articulate to the business the necessities beyond spending for a tool?
Well, and going back, as you talk about the justifying the tool spend, that becomes the problem. If we've already checked the box, and then we say, well, we want to spend more money in this area, but wait, you're check the box. Yeah, what do you do? Yeah.
Want to color in the
It goes
circle a
from
little better.
It goes from a checkbox to an X now. Like, there's no bonus points for that, so it becomes hard to justify that incremental spend as we're building out the program. As a practitioner, and we think about it from a strategic perspective, it makes complete sense, right? If we talk about adversaries, risks are continually growing, they're changing their dynamic, therefore we have to change our tools, change our processes, the way we do things. But as you bring that back to a traditional framework, it doesn't lend itself to telling that story. It becomes much more difficult.
So after you baseline, what do you do after you have a baseline? Like what's in maturing your cybersecurity program? What do you do after you baseline? What's next?
Well, after baseline, so for me, I think actually step one is it becomes kind of a litmus test on going into the baseline that you already have objectives, you've already got a strategy. So then it's kind of checking against that baseline, right? Are we already heading in the right direction? For us, I think it really solidified for us that the strategy we had set and some of the areas we were focusing on were the right ones, because those really came out through the score, which was great. Again, back to storytelling, and it's John Bingham, I think, put it at one point on an Avanta event that he was the chief storyteller. And I love that. And that's really a big component of the role because that's what we're doing. We're telling that story and helping the executive leadership understand why we have to do the things that we're going to do, why we're spending money. And that's where the baseline coupled with our strategy, that if it backs it up, lends itself very well to telling that story on why we need to head in this direction.
And I wanted to take that one step deeper because you, as the CISO, you've built that program, and it really did validate what you were doing because those deficiencies showed up in those areas you had already built programs.
Wait,
and
we
were
had
working towards.
deficiencies? Oh.
And so it was really awesome to see that validation. But there's another thing that you can dig deeper. If you look at simply compliance and you look at a set of controls, how do you look at things that are systemic? How are you able to say, from a control perspective, if you, in particular screen I'm showing now, if you go up to the top and you say, okay, what about my policies? These are domains. These are IT domains. This doesn't talk about where the policies are. But if you come down and you start looking at this and say, okay, this is systemic. I'm having governance and policy issues, deficiencies, and no, this isn't Eric's organization. This was another one. And these are the deficiencies across many domains. And I think that is where you start getting this 3D view of it's not just about the compliance, it's multiple compliances, and it's looking at those deficiencies in the side of the business, not just the IT technical controls.
Right. Right, and that's, I'll go back to what I said earlier, that as we talked about, good people doing good things often results in checking the box. That, yeah, of course we're doing that. Okay, Bob's been doing that for X number of years. Bob just got a new job or he decided to retire. And now that process is where? If it's not documented, if it's not repeatable, if nobody knows about it, are you going to uncheck that box? How does that work?
But legacy knowledge just walked out the door.
Exactly. Now going through this, and it's kind of a paradigm shift and looking kind of the depth of maturity, you can start to call that out that, hey, I have a deficiency here. We have to actually make this a repeatable process that anybody can pick up at any time and continue on.
What we're seeing with compliance mandates more and more is that governing bodies, federal legislature, state legislature, they're starting to more and more ask for measuring it over time. So it's not anymore you're compliant. It's continually providing that evidence over time.
And
think that's
CMMC
changed.
for the Department of Defense is the perfect example of that. You've got 330,000 organizations that are now having to come up with meeting a specific set of compliances, and these have been around since 2017. It was DFARS 800-171. And now they're saying you have to be compliant now, and you have to be able to validate and prove that compliance over the next 36 months. It's not this cycle of once a year, come in, do an assessment. It is maintaining that consistently, and then having a tool that actually can demonstrate and attest to that consistency.
Point in time with an auditor, it's like getting audited by the IRS. You have to be able to provide that evidence at any time, not just tax day, right? Yes, I think that's a really good point. One of the things that's interesting about CMMC, I don't know if any of you sell if your organization sell to the Department of Defense, but we're seeing a couple of things on that side of the line as well, where CMMC is likely to be adopted by other government agencies, or they're coming up with their own certification. So even if your organization isn't doing business with the DoD, maybe they're doing business with I don't know, FTC or Department of Agriculture or whatever. Especially with the leadership of, I don't know if any of you were at the Michigan Cybersecurity Summit or whatever it was and heard Jen Easterly speak, but the CSA is now looking at, they've given these 37 controls guidance, the 37 basic things you need to be cyber secure. But more and more we're seeing these mandates kind of collide and make that joined. Eric, we talked again a little bit about this before, but preparation and readiness, how does that, when the mandates come down to the wire, how does preparation and readiness, what does that do for you? And as you grow this program, what do you anticipate that will do for you?
Yeah, so I think from being prepared, be prepared for what we don't know yet, right? That it's, from a compliance perspective, as the news headlines continue to grow in kind of frequency and the size of companies, compliance is going to continue to evolve, right? It becomes very agile. and having the ability to adapt to those different controls and then map it back to what we're already looking at for maturity, I think becomes huge. Because it really goes back to what I was talking about with the OEMs, right? The OEMs rating each of those frameworks. Well, it's the same thing if we look at compliance on the whole, that all of our frameworks are going to continue to change. I mean, if we go back, and I don't know, I forget how long the CSA has been around, but now we've got all of these cloud compliance controls, and I mean, it's continually evolving, and those requirements are going to get pushed down on us. So the ability to quickly adapt and attest to those different frameworks is huge.
Eric, I have a question. Kind of back to the comment you made about John Bingham saying, I'm a chief storyteller.
Yeah.
By the way, I hope we can't reference John anymore. I literally.
I've heard he's always fair game, so I hope he's watching.
I just saw him this summer at a field hockey game. But have you found that over time, when you're working with the executive team and with the board, John said I'm the chief storyteller, but are you finding that they are getting a little more savvy, a little more sophisticated? Are the questions you're getting now from the board and executive team not just, hey, are we okay? Is it becoming more like, how are we doing this, or more granular?
Yeah, it's definitely growing over time. And a couple of components of that, because if you look at the board members, they've all recognized now that there's an element that they're at risk, right? Their duty is to protect the organization they're part of. So it's not enough to say, well, I don't know. That's not a defensible position anymore. So a lot of board members, number one, are sitting on multiple companies. So I think the understanding, it's super critical to understand what some of your peers are doing for their security programs, because you're going to be asked the same questions. But then a lot of them have advisors on the side. And directly to your question, I mean, if you look at what the SEC is talking about putting out on the disclosures from public companies on what's the experience of board members, on what's their cyber background, as well as what are your controls in place, the answer is yes. They are becoming more savvy because they have to become more savvy. They're understanding our space.
And I think in some cases they even have like personal liability.
Yes, they can. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And-
Joe
and-
Sullivan,
yeah.
prime example. Yep.
And we're seeing that, and they're asking better questions. And the questions have kind of changed. It's not just tell me that we're secure. It's not are we secure, which is a yes or no question. They're asking how, what are we doing, what am I gaining in reduction of business risk from this spend?
Right.
And so you get a board member that says, I have just spent $5 million a year for the last 3 years. What value are you giving me for this spend, and why are you now asking me for 7?
Difficult to measure, right? I mean, it's just like buying insurance. You don't need it till you need it, right?
Right. Yeah, and I would say, I would imagine more boards are going to start getting deeper into the actual operations of security. I've heard of boards that are wanting to sit through the tabletop exercises to watch over that. We had an opportunity, actually, the head of our audit committee came in and for half a day sat with the SOC team. And hey, here, what's a day in the life of the SOC team look like? Which was great, because it gave, not only did he come out with understanding what we're looking at, what we're concerned about on a daily basis, but if you think about the team's perspective, they had the opportunity to give a presentation to a board member. So it was a win-win, and it was great to have that interest.
In fact, some of them joined in some of the sessions we had. What we were doing with you had compliance team members that were joining those sessions and asking questions, asking validation questions, and going back to their audit teams.
Right.
Taking back information that was gained during these sessions.
Ron, I think you brought up some interesting stuff. I wanted to hit this third-party risk management. I wanted to ask you a little bit about again, this is something everybody's struggling with now. What's your take on third-party risk management? What's important to that? What are you doing?
Yeah, so first of all, third-party risk management is tough. Because, I mean, if you look at some of us in automotive, and actually, it's not unique to us, how many suppliers we really have. And there's the suppliers we know of, and then there's the rest, which is, in some cases, probably larger than the volume of the ones that we do know about. But in the context of automotive suppliers, I mean, it's a natural progression that if our customers are asking us to be compliant, asking us to attest to our controls, naturally, I need to start pushing that down the chain to our suppliers. Right? So that becomes a huge element that we're trying to figure out from a capacity standpoint on how do we do that. Because if you think about our supply base, we have anybody from companies that are bigger than us to some that might be a mom and pop operation. So if we try to push down one set of controls in this kind of one framework fits all, we're going to do the same thing to them that was done to us with all of the different frameworks that were pushed down on us. So we have to become more granular and understand what the actual business risk is from that supplier. What's the impact that they could have to our operations? And then that would dictate the level of controls or questions that we ask them about their maturity.
And it's interesting you bring that up because that's exactly what we're showing on the screen is you have the risk register. And as you're building those business risks, you can tie those risks directly into the third party. And so now that third party vendor risk assessment is directly driven off of the risks that you've identified to that business. So it becomes holistic from a business standpoint.
And certainly, and if you think about an organizational growth perspective, as we look at some of our procurement departments, are probably some of the strongest departments out there. Automotive procurement they do
Tough, but
It can be a tough group. But if you look at their processes in most organizations, they're super mature, right? They're looking at the financials of the company, the impact that they could have to operationals, and there's different metrics that they're pulling in. And traditionally, cyber's not one of them, but it needs to be one of them. And that's one of the things that we're exploring. How do we take that back and quantify what that risk is and push that back up the chain so as procurement's making decisions on the different suppliers, we can give them additional set of information to help them make the right decision.
It was interesting, just to something that Ron said, that's some of the things we talked about a year ago was, are those contracts? Do these clauses in there, do they report? What is that method of which they report back for breaches on their end? And so exactly what you were talking about are the things that we were discussing a year ago that affects that maturity score. Because your maturity score is going to go down if you don't have those contracts in that third-party management side. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you mentioned a very good point, tying the third party to the risk register. You brought up a very good point, tying up the third party risk to the risk register. Could you give a little bit more in-depth analysis about how you can tie those two? Might be using the same tool. If I'm talking about third party risk, I'm very much interested in software bill of materials.
Do you want to repeat the question real quick?
Yeah, I can
Just
repeat
so
the question.
it goes
Or
online.
actually, your mic's working now, so go ahead and repeat the question. I'm going to bring it up.
All right, repeat. So you bring up a very good point with risk register, tying up the risk register. Again,
And so what I'm going to do is bring up the
I'd
risk
blame
register
the AV guy
because
again.
you absolutely were talking about the ability to tie business risks to those third-party vendors. And the SBOM, I definitely want to talk about that. Because we were just with the group out in California a couple weeks ago. And one of the largest things the government is looking at is mandating an SBOM on every application that they use in the DIB, period. And so what we've been talking with them about, I'm going to kind of limb here. Let's just say there's a solution that's being worked on that's tied into this.
by an executive order also for that. So
Yes.
it is very much needed.
Yes, absolutely.
SBOM, are you saying that someone is asking you for third-party attestation, like validation when you're talking about an SBOM? Are you saying you're asking for that from your suppliers, or
Customers.
they're asking you, show me? When you say an SBOM, that's all the software that you're using, open source, whatever. That's
It is.
yeah. So the problem could be if you're using some kind of open source something or another, and then there's really no controls
What's your
around
library?
source code, and
Yes.
someone could inject something in there, and then okay.
Yes, absolutely. And that's specifically what's happening is they're saying, where are vulnerabilities? And you brought up one of the ones that was a big one because it affected so many more things. And we
Yeah,
talked
everybody
about,
loves Log4j.
Yeah, exactly. And that really showed the industry no one knew where Log4j was in their code. And it was places that no one ever thought. But if there had been an SBOM, you would be able to go show me everywhere this version of this control or this tool, this library is used in any of our applications, and you can begin to remediate that long before you're just trying to figure out where it is.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's a natural evolution. I mean, using Log4j as the example, how many of us were doing scans across our environment? Hey, show me where Log4j exists. But could you ever actually answer the question, was it actually being used? Was it in the software? Sure, the library was there, but is there an actual risk?
Yeah. And is that risk open to ability to, is it an active risk?
Right.
Is there something that where it can actually be totally lost the word I was looking for there, but basically it becomes a vulnerability to the organization because many times some of these things, they're compensating controls. It's
Right.
behind firewalls, it's behind other things, and so you don't have that. For some organizations, it is not as large of a risk, a potential from the outside as it is
true.
to others because it is open to that outside. And so what I just brought up was a risk here. I mean, and we're not going to go into risk management and the contingency and the project management pieces, but you'll see this as a vendor risk. I just wanted to show you the vendor risk. Now I'm going to go back to the home page, and we're going to quickly go into vendor risk management. And if I click on the third-party risk management piece, now I can go in, and you saw that risk from the risk register. You were asking how these tied together. So now I'm going to click on my third-party risk, and you got to love the cellular internet service we have here is super fast. And so what'll eventually possibly come up is that third-party piece. And so you look at that vendor and then see what risks are tied to that vendor. And so now you've built the risks within your organization. Hey, it did come up. And now you have the ability to go in, look at those vendors, find out what those risks are, see what, and you see that was the very first one, ADP, we're going to bring it up. And now, if you click on that vendor, there's 3 risks that are off of your risk register. I can now go to my third-party risks, and it's going to populate what those risks were. And so now you've got your risk assessments that you're currently doing, and those risk assessments are driven, this is a medium, based on those risks. And now here are those third-party risks, and if I were to click on this first one, you're going to see it open the risk register and give me the risk mitigation, the contingency plan, and everything about it. So it's 2 different departments. One's managing your risk, one's managing your risk register, and that other one's managing your third parties, but now you're able to tie that together.
Facts are that this is becoming not a separate thing. It's a part of your overall risk posture. As Ron mentioned earlier, it's really about securing your organization. It's not about playing compliance whack-a-mole. It's figuring out what that real baseline is, and then being able to cross-map it against the frameworks and requirements that you have. Eric, I know we're just about out of time. I want to make sure that there's an opportunity for people to ask questions if they want it. But before we do that, what advice would you give someone embarking on this path right now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my advice would be philosophically challenge how you're viewing compliance. I would look at very similar to Ron, that early on in my career that I would have looked at compliance and said, yeah, really, do we have to do this? Do I have to write these documentations? But I really think in the evolution of business and how we're looking at business risk in the context of cybersecurity, it's changing. And I think we're really sitting at the cusp of security being able to be a business differentiator, that it can start driving additional business, and that's huge. And sitting at the center of that really is compliance and how we view it and looking at it as organizational risk within the business processes that we have.
That makes sense. If I look at, I've had the privilege of working in this market for almost 30 years, 20 of those in cybersecurity, and if I look at the people that I find to be most successful in this business, they're the people that have looked at the business and understood what is it that the objective of my organization, what is the objective of my organization, and how can I not be perceived as a department of no, but the department of enablement? Because that's really, in the end, we talk about the CIA triangle, but I just got in an argument with somebody online about this recently on a podcast, just about the difference between, it's a triangle because it's supposed to be balanced, and often security is perceived as the confidentiality department, and it's not. It's really about enablement. So thank you for that, Eric. Any questions? Any other questions for Eric or Robert? Any comments? I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. Come talk to us. Be happy to share our experiences. And with Saturus, talk to Eric. He'll be very, very candid about his experience with Saturus. And we hope we have an opportunity to give some of you a demo of our platform. And would love to talk with you about how we might help. So thanks a lot. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. And with that, I guess I'll close it out as well. So now I got to switch back to my slides. All right. So just as a reminder from a membership perspective, the easiest thing out here, go to LinkedIn. Join the page, click there, we'll let you into the group. That's the best way to get communications from us. Rob put you on the mailing list for all of our events. Easiest way to connect. CPE credits, renew, raise your hand. She is your go-to for all CPE credits, so send her an email and she'll be able to get that out to you. And last but not least, thank you very much. Appreciate everybody coming out and hope everybody has safe travels home.